Vous m'entendez? Ça va? Alors, je vais présenter ma communication aujourd'hui en anglais, qui est la langue de mon université, mais je vous sollicite bien sûr à me poser des questions ou à faire des remarques aussi en français. Today, in my paper, I will propose to the general discussion an outline of my new research project, which is a study of the genealogy of the New Left in Western Europe from the mid-50s to the mid-70s. Breaking with current interpretations, I contend that we need to reframe the European political geography to include post-colonial space and to reassess the historical influence of the Algerian War of Independence and Third Worldism more generally in the genealogy of the new political cultures that flourished during the long 60s. My aim is to set out new approaches to understanding the emerging of the New Left as a complex process encompassing local, national, and transnational dynamics, a process shaped by, but also shaping, decolonisation. The goal is to contribute, at least, to complicating the Western narrative of the global 60s by shifting the focus from Berkeley and Paris to Algiers. The wider periodization of the long global 60s has produced a significant advance in the understanding of the social and political movements in the aftermath of the Second World War, going beyond a myopic approach often concerned only with the Parisian May or, at the best, extending back to the 64-65 free speech movement at Berkeley. As Charles Mayer wrote recently, for those who want to study 1968 more deeply, it will be necessary to understand the grip and the ideological hegemony of the 50s, sous les pavés, le passé. As Christopher Culter has shown for the French case in his seminal book published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, the New Left developed in many Western countries from the mid-50s onwards, contemporaneous with the process of decolonisation. This left moved outside the established organization of social democracy, communism, and left Catholicism, and indeed became harshly opposed to them. In this process, radical anti-colonialism was its key distinguishing feature. The New Left framed the anti-colonial struggle as a new anti-fascism by comparing groups such as the Algerian liberation movement to the Second World War resistance and the enemies to the Nazis and their fascist allies. The strong engagement of French intellectuals against the practice of torture during the Battle of Algiers, 1957, transposed the Algerian War into a European ethical divide. The Battle of Algiers, perhaps not so much the reality as the movie by the Italian director Gillo Pontecorvo, former partisan and communist, marked the New Left deeply. The Battle of Algiers, a generation of militants reappropriated the narrative of the resistance as not merely defensive, but proactive, merging the myth of the betrayed resistance still to be accomplished because severed from the social revolution with the image of imperialism as the new fascism. The European Civil War, identified by Enzo Traverso as the main feature of the first half of the 20th century, 1914-45, was hence reconfigured anew worldwide as a global civil war, driven by the Algerian War of Independence. Thus, my research focuses on the cultural and practical consequences for the militants of the long 60s of this reactivation of the anti-fascist front. For many, the Algerian Revolution would be a shifting point in their political education. Echoing the damp of the earth, and the first line of the French version of their International, used by Frantz Fanon as the title of his famous work, Les Damnés de la Terre, 1961, these militants would often become the damned of the revolution. The replay of the fascism-anti-fascism divide within a new global civil war would configure an ethical disjuncture out of which emerges the idea of absolute enmity against an absolute enemy. This concept was proposed by Carl Schmitt in his Theory of the Partisan. Published in 1963, the book was deeply influenced by the author's experience during the Second World War and by the guerrilla warfare of the recently ended Algerian War. I contend this global civil war framework is a key feature of the new political cultures that emerged during the long 60s, triggered by decolonisation and the Cold War. This global civil war framework also had significant consequences for the process of social legitimization of political violence in relevant sectors of the new radical left. In other words, the research seeks to test the hypothesis that the Algerian War of Independence, despite having received relatively little attention by most scholars of the long 60s, occupies a core place in the genealogy of the new radical left, having set the political and conceptual framework, namely the global civil war, by which the victory of Castro and Guevara, Cuba 1959, or the triumph of the Viet Cong, Tet Offensive 1968, would be later understood. Although Cuba and Vietnam certainly became key references in their revolutionary canon, they took place far from Europe. Exactly because of this distance, they would progressively supersede Algeria in the new left radical pantheon, offering a more useful screen for a projective and exotic political imagination. Algeria was different, not only because of its position on the southern shore of the Mediterranean basin, but also because of its specific interior exteriority for European political geography. Did not de Gaulle say, "La Méditerranée traverse la France comme la Seine traverse Paris"? Thus, we may indeed ask what, after independence, was Europe and what was not? What was Algeria and what was not? The perspective that I propose to adopt thus moves beyond standard histories of political parties and international relations and turns to their cultural history of politics. And I'm borrowing this concept from the seminal work by French historian Jean-François Sirinelli. In so doing, the project studies the anti-colonial networks in and among Italy, France, and of course, Algeria, the Mecca of revolution, as Cabral called it, seen as a key element of the global 60s. The periodization that the research seeks to test takes as terminus post-quem the Battle of Algiers, 1957, and as terminus ad quem the full liberation of Saigon, 1975. What I contend is that for the transnational public of the New Left, the first Battle of Algiers marks the short circuit between the Algerian War and the memory of the Holocaust and the Second World War, while the second marks the end of third worldism as a political project. The research directly relates to recent developments in four relevant historiographical debates. First, it refers to the historiographical renewal on the European memories of the resistance. The memories of the Second World War and of the anti-fascist resistance are, of course, a key feature of the political imagination of the new radical left. However, despite the impressive list of scholarly investigation that have pointed to this thing, the historiography is not satisfactorily focused on the Algerian War and decolonization as a catalyzer of this resurgence of the past in the present. To my knowledge, the only specific exception is Marty Evans' The Memory of the Resistance, French opposition to the Algerian War, published in 1997. The memory of the anti-fascist struggle and of the Nazi occupation played a central role in the imaginary of these transnational militant circles, serving for decades as a comprehensive perceptive filter, to quote Peter Verhoeven. For a generation that assumed itself to be part of a revolutionary history, Jean-Paul Sartre's prison visit to the hunger-striking RAF founder Andrea in December 1974 connects with great clarity the points of a constellation that extends from World War II through the Algerian War to the new anti-fascism, reconfigured as a global civil war. What traveled from one point to another of this invented tradition were not only powerful images and myth, but also what Charles Tilly has called repertoires of collective action. This conceptual tool allows us to address a new debate on social movements and political violence. However, with a few remarkable exceptions, for instance, Prince Lobedien Foreign Front, Third World Politics in 60s West Germany, published in 2012, with a few remarkable exceptions, the literature has underestimated the influence of the Algerian War and decolonization in the genealogy of the New Left repertoires. It thereby fails to explain how, towards the end of the long 60s, a significant faction of these militants would discover, like Fanon's Algerian peasants, that only violence pays. And I'm quoting from Hannah Arendt's On Violence, published in the US in 1970. Second, the project relates to newly published studies that have began to reconsider the long 60s in a less Eurocentric perspective, focusing on the global South and its connection with Europe. However, the research does not just study the generic impact of Thoroughgoodism in one or more national cases, but proposes a post-colonial genealogy of the Western European New Left, focusing on Algeria in order to produce the first connected history, approaching the long 60s as a truly transnational moment of change. For this project, I make use of global history to tackle these issues of complex simultaneous spatiality. Various definitions of global history have been offered so far. Here built mainly on the approach of global microhistory and connected history proposed by Francesca Pivellato and Sanjay Subramaniam, focusing on the transformative dimension of translocal encounters. This entails pushing the analysis beyond the nation-state and looking for alternative or complementary spaces within which specific historical actors experience and construct the world. This approach is particularly effective when combined with an oral history methodology, as in a recent pioneering study on Europe's 1968, and I'm thinking to the book edited by Robert Gilder, Europe's 1968, Voices of Rebel, published by OUP in 2013. However, these studies focus mainly on the East-West exchanges and disregard the North-South dimension, which is at the core of my research. Moreover, this project encompasses a global intellectual history and a bottom-up approach by grounding its focus on cultures and practices of grassroots activist networks. Finally, it refers to the growing interest among scholars in Frantz Fanon's theories. Fanon was a global bestseller during the long 60s. He needs to be understood as one of the key figures that made the Algerian War legible to a new radical left for whom decolonization was also conceived as a decolonization of the mind, the self. Fanon's work, like Marx's 1844 manuscripts, became an instrument for understanding the alienation of the capitalist condition. Moreover, the project focuses on three dimensions. First, transnational networks. I tried to test the hypothesis that it was during the Algerian War that radical anti-colonialism started to imagine itself as a new anti-fascism, connecting with a proactive memory of the resistance. The Algerian War, in fact, was not only the inverted replay of the Second World War, this time with the French in the role of the Nazis. But Algeria was, in all respects, part of the history of the European anti-fascist struggle. Algerian soldiers had fought for the liberation of Europe in the French army, and while de Gaulle was in London, Algiers was the capital of France Libre. In this perspective, looking through the anti-colonial networks in and among Algeria, France, and Italy, the project focuses on the lives, experiences, and memories of grassroots militants, women and men, who in different ways engage in these networks. Who were they? Why and how did they get involved? What were the tasks or desires? With which other networks were they in touch? How do they represent their enemy and therefore themselves? And 60 years later, how do they compose their memories of this anti-colonial militancy? Moreover, to what extent did Algerians, French, and Italians share a common ethos, if any? What were the reciprocal influences between the new radical left and the Algerian Revolution before and after independence? We need also to pay specific attention to the gender dimension. Many women fought in the Algerian War. Were they as influenced by Western models as much as they would influence them through figures such as Jamila Ben Pasha from the Algiers bombing network? Another research dimension concerns political cultures. Scholarship on political cultures is a burgeoning field in contemporary historical studies, lying at the crossroads of political history and cultural history. According to Jean-François Sivinelli and Eric Vigne, a political culture consists in a sort of court and series of referents, formalized within an organization or more broadly spread among a political family or a political tradition. This approach is particularly useful in analyzing the critical impact of decolonization on social democracy, communism, and left Catholicism in Western Europe during the Cold War, and the contemporaneous formation of a new anti-colonial, anti-imperialist ethic within and beyond the political parties. The Algerian War was also a turning point in this respect, revealing divisions and discontent inside traditional left organizations that appeared to the anti-colonial militants progressively, morally delegitimized. Algerian peasants and Cuban guerrilla fighters, rather than the gentrified workers or trade unions of the First World, became, in the eyes of the emerging transnational new radical left, the real actors in the world revolution they dreamed. In this perspective, Third Worldism was a political project more than a geographical space. It was also an attempt to experiment with other political geographies, which cut across the binary Cold War status quo. New left parties such as the PSU in France or the PSUP in Italy were born, blending these shared views with national and local features. The research thus pursues a diachronic study of how established organization of the left coped with decolonization, and more specifically with Algeria. Why did this become unsatisfactory for a growing number of militants, giving birth to what would later be called the New Left? And conversely, in which way, if any, was the horizon of expectation of the Algerian National Liberation Front, and later also the opposition movements, Berbers, the FFS, the Front des Forces Socialistes, led by Hossein Hamed, influenced by the rising New Left, particularly through Coopérant and Pied Rouge? We need to explore and test the consistency of these new transnational political cultures, sometimes overlapping with, but also progressively exceeding the Cold War cultures. In this framework, the issue of political violence needs to be reconsidered, aiming to better understand the relation between the global civil war and the radicalization of the repertoires of collective action. And on the screen is a famous iconic picture of the Bombed Women Network of Algiers. Finally, cultural infrastructure as vectors of transnational connections. The circulations of people, ideas, texts, images, and songs, very important songs, was a prominent feature of the Algerian War. My research builds on these to highlight the emergence of a new transnational public since the 1950s. Particular attention is paid to the networks of intellectuals who played a pivotal role in the process of transnational dissemination of ideas and mobilization models. A few small independent publishers, Éditions de Nuit, Maspero in France, Feltrinelli in Italy, and others, of course, or libraries. For instance, La Librairie du Tiers-Monde, which opened in Algiers in 1965, made a substantial contribution to promoting a new political agenda. Now to conclude, in this transnational movement of ideas and practices, a key role was played by the networks directly supporting the Algerian struggle. Unfortunately, there is still very little scholarship on these informal groups, mostly limited to the main characters of the two best-known French réseau networks, the one led by Sartre philosopher Francis Janson, and the other organized around the Egypt-born communist Henri Furiel. Beyond these charismatic Parisian intellectuals, we know almost nothing about the militants involved at different levels of the networks. Nearly nothing about their relations with the Algerians, and next to nothing about their context and links with the other networks active in Belgium, Germany, Italy, Switzerland. We do know, however, that the elders among these anti-colonial militants had often been partisans in the resistance, as with Janson in France or Giovanni Pirelli in Italy. Anti-fascism as anti-colonialism in the framework of the new global civil war was a shared ethos. Thank you.